I find it interesting how often people are triggered by hearing of others who are slowing down and taking their time in learning about the horse, or perhaps learning a different perspective in how they perceive the horse, acknowledge the horse's feedback, and learn to work with him. It is interesting to see how many people get defensive because things aren't hurried, things aren't done in a manner that's demanding rigid obedience, but instead is allowing for what I call a two-way conversation. I think it's interesting how often we have this preconceived notion or demands of how the horse should respond, and that things are good and bad or right and wrong without having any room for adaptability in the often unrealistic rigidity that we have in expectations of our horse, without having any accountability or self awareness in recognizing how our behaviors are influencing the horse's responses. It's interesting to see how many unasked for opinions are imposed on people who are learning or who are trying to take the time in refining their self awareness. It is interesting to see how many people are so quick to judge the horse for his reactions without ever assessing what are the holes in the horse's education that led to the current unwanted responses. I find it curious when people will say things aren't a big deal and yet then, without taking a breath, say that they're still working on the same thing repetitiously without feeling like they have much success with their horse. I think it's interesting how we've normalized that horses are defensive and fearful, hard to catch, difficult to load in the trailer, reluctant to be saddled, resistant to be mounted, and often carry anticipation throughout the ride, whether or not we've done things many times previously. I find it hard that we've desensitized humans to the fact that horses are constantly communicating, teaching people to ignore the horse's subtle feedback and then critiquing him when he finally expresses behaviors in a way that can no longer be managed, contained, shut down, or criticized. I think it's interesting how often we have this human imposed urgency of having to hurry up and educate the horse, usually when his mind and body are still quite immature and cannot take the severity and the repetition and the imbalanced riding and the quick fix training tactics that later you see the consequences of a few years down the road, whether it's mental or physical breakdowns. It's interesting how many people talk about interactions with their horse in a manner of trying to survive situations and then later earning bragging rights for doing so, rather than acknowledging how that fearful experience for the human was also one for the horse and how that might be detrimental to future interactions. It's interesting to see how many times people will work intensely on one aspect of the interaction, but then completely disregard the horse's feedback afterwards when there's a fleeing or an avoidance or an increased tension, and then decide it's time to move on to something else without recognizing that their unwillingness to acknowledge the horse is going to create much more work to undo in the future than if they slowed down and took the time to help the horse learn how to mentally work through a situation in order to offer reasonable and adaptable physical behaviors. I think it's curious that we have learned to create patterns in our own life of convenience because we are often distracted in attempting to multitask and hurry things along and brag about how much we can take on. And yet, when we bring this mentality to the horse, it actually causes more concern, fear, and chaos in the interaction, leading often to unwanted outcomes that then we criticize the horse for, rather than recognizing how what it is that we're doing is lacking mental presence, any sort of specific communication, not acknowledging the horse, and teaching him to be fearful and distrustful of us, creating the avoidant defensive behaviors.